Hey, John here. A friend handed me a few of her wands and asked if I could build a display for them. Yes, a few. I'm pretty sure she has them all. Well, I first pulled out what she handed me so I could get a feel for how big these wands were and the best way to display them. So for now, I am basing my measurements for the display with a 2-inch gap between each wand. I identified the longest wand and I used that to find out how wide the display should be. Adding 3 inches on each side, the display will end up being 2 feet wide. I think this is a good solid number. This is the point I had a eureka moment and thought I would make it look like one of the windows in Diagon Alley. And since I just finished the Honeyduke sweep shop window, I could use what I learned there and just modify it a bit at a much smaller scale. So to make this display look like a window that is old and weathered, I will use a charred wood stain. Hopefully this will also make it look a little spooky, like the wand shop itself. I am using a piece of poplar wood that can be found at either Lowe's or Home Depot. My first cut will be at 2 feet 6 inches. After cutting the length, I set the table saw at 1 1/4 inches and ripped 2 pieces from the board. So now I have my height. I need to go back and cut my width. We said earlier that 2 feet even was going to be the width. So make your mark and cut it at the miter saw. With all your sides cut, you can now cut the corners at 45-degree angles so we can put our frame together. Just like a shadow box, I am going to create a glass groove so the display board will be seated inside the frame. I do this by matching the width of the display board to a few dado blades. Then I run the frame pieces across the table saw at about 1/4 inch from the edge of each piece. Make sure you align all your pieces before you cut them so you don't end up with a groove on the wrong side of a board. Measure from the end of your groove to the other end of your groove on each height and width piece. Then using a piece of birch plywood, make your marks. I chose the birch for its weight. I knew this was going to be hanging on a wall, so I wanted it to be as light as possible. Next, take some Elmer's glue and put down a healthy coat and spread it out thin. Then take your felt and apply it directly to the board. Ensure your hands are clean and then evenly spread the felt out so there are no lumps. Cut the excess felt at the edge. Then I ran each piece of the frame twice over the table saw for about a 1/8 inch groove. This was just to give it a little flair. And then I quickly sanded them down and stained them and allowed them to sit in the sun for a few minutes before I began putting the frame together. With a little bit of wood glue, I place a bead in the slot. Then, using a putty knife, I slide in the display board into the groove. The putty knife allows you to keep the felt in place and prevent it from getting bunched up. Continue this process until all the sides are on, and then place a small brad to hold the sides in place until the glue dries. Okay, I wanted the look of the round parts of the shop windows, so I measured the inside of the frame. Yes, I'm making this up as I go along, so in my head, I did not want to waste any of the display board, so I will attach this to the top and the bottom, and I will take up no more than 1 inch of the felted area. I can see this in my head, but I'm sure you can improve on my design once you see how mine comes out. So I grabbed another piece of poplar, this time 12-inch wide board, and I cut it at 2 feet. Then I cut that piece exactly in half. Now I can take you into the mind of John and show you how I make a perfect arch without any fancy tools in the piece that I just cut. Find the center of your board. It should be 1 foot or pretty close to that. Then place a mark on the edge. Draw a straight line from that mark to each corner of the board. Then just freehand the arch. Once done, find the halfway mark from the edge to the center of the board and make another mark. Measure down to your line. Do that on the exact opposite side using those measurements. They won't be too far off, but once marked, you can see how much more of your bend is needed to ensure they match perfectly. I got pretty lucky, and mine was only about 1/8 of an inch off. Not really noticeable to the naked eye, but you can make the correction now. Using a jigsaw or a bandsaw, Now you can cut out your arch. Okay, the second one is easy. No more fancy measuring. Simply use your first arch as a template and trace out the second arch onto the second piece and then cut it. Now we have two identical pieces, but we need four. So this next step you will actually need a bandsaw. If you don't have one, leave your pieces thick and use one of your arches to create two more the same way. Now if you do have a bandsaw, rip each piece in half so you will now have four pieces. I did this to keep the display as light as possible. This next step is a little bit overkill and really does not need to be done, but what I did here is I put a small rabbet on the edge of the arch so I could put an inlay and it would lay flush with the front of the arch. I took the backing off an old picture frame and thought that that would be strong but flimsy enough to bend and attach to the face of the arch. I cut two pieces at 4 inches wide. Holding the arch in place, I bent the piece around the arch and mark it for a perfect fit. Then I cut both pieces at my mark. I had cut my arches pretty thin and my rabbets were not as wide as I had hoped. Trying to make this work, I realized that I would have a hard time attaching this to the faceplate. So, yes, I failed, but an easy fix in my mind. So I went back and I cut a few small blocks that I could tie the face to. Had I been thinking clearly, I should have had made these long enough to attach both the top and bottom arches. This would have saved me a lot of time, but that's what happens when you're an amateur. Remember to make your mark on the top piece. This keeps your blocks out of the way of the display frame when you attach them. When I went back to attach the faceplate, this is when I was trying to stabilize the arches just so I could get it attached. And I realized, hey, I should have made my blocks long enough to attach both arches, then I wouldn't have this problem. So while I was doing this with scrap pieces, I thought I would just go ahead and use the pieces that I picked up to join the back sides of both arches together. Now my faceplate would have plenty to tie into without me worrying about splitting the arches with brads. But don't attach them to the arches yet. So, learning from my mistake, I cut the pieces to fit all the way across for the second set of arches. See, even I can improve from my first try. While the glue is drying on my second arch, I attached hanging brackets on the back of the frame. You need to do this early, as once we attach the arches, the back side of your display will be very difficult to work on. So grab a tape measure, measure down about 3 inches from the top, mark, and then place your bracket up to the mark. Trace out all the screw holes and the opening. Then countersink your screw holes, and then route out a shallow area for the screw head, staying within your traced lines. Yes, this is where kindergarten pays off. If you skipped kindergarten, you will probably have a hard time staying within the lines. Okay, bad dad joke. Earlier, before attaching the faceplates, I decided to make the arches as high and as low as possible on the display. This would save display space and would allow for more wands on the display board. This is an extra step, but I think in the end, with more space for more wands, the owner will be pleased. So I notched out an area on the faceplate that would allow me to move my arch all the way to the top and bottom of the display frame. This is why I did not attach the faceplates to the arches earlier. If you did attach your faceplates, no biggie, you can go right ahead and attach them inside the perimeter of the display frame. Completely up to you. Extra work never bothers me. It's just another excuse to cut something. And we all love cutting, that's why we're here. Or you're just an insane Harry Potter fan and you love this stuff. Which reminds me, if you made it this far in the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. Before you glue and tack on your faceplate, make some quick marks so you don't have to guess where your tie-in blocks are located. Then put down a bead of glue in your rabbited area and tack in your faceplate. Don't worry about any messy glue, just wipe up what you can and then tack the whole thing down. Using around 300 grit sandpaper, clean up your arches of all that excess glue and give it an overall once-over. And prepare your arches for staining. Using the same charred stain I showed you at the beginning of this video, stain your arches. This next step is a little bit beyond a do-it-yourself, so I will go pretty quickly through it, but I need to include it to show you how I came up with the wording on my arch. You will bypass this step and simply paint your letters directly onto the arch. I cut a piece to fit inside the arch and a few scrap pieces to act as a lip for the piece to sit on. Then I paint the back plate bright yellow and the entire inside of the arch yellow. I take the face plate and with a CNC router I cut out the letters of Ollivanders onto it. With the paint now dry, I put the top arch back together by snapping in my yellow back plate and then attaching the face plate to my front. I repeat the same steps I used to make the first arch by sanding and staining. Once dry, I simply tack each arch into the frame to hold it into position. Now that your arches are attached, we can move on to the pegs that the wands will sit on. I took the thickest wand to see how long they would need to be. I wanted all my pegs the same size, so use your thickest wand to figure this out. Lift them a bit from the ground when doing this because you don't want them touching the display board. It will look a little more professional if they look like they are floating out and away from the back display. I decided on 1.5 inches for my pegs. I used a 3/8 inch dowel. At Home Depot, these are the ones with the green ends. I cut one at that length and then used it as a template to cut the other ones. I do this by setting up my stop holder on my miter saw and placing the dowel between the saw blade and a scrap piece. Then screw down the scrap piece tight. Using the scrap piece as a backstop, you can now cut as many pegs as you intend to use on your display, and each cut will be identical. I cut a few extra pegs just in case, and then I set up for my next step, was to place countersink holes in each peg. This would help guide and keep the screws in the center of each peg as I mounted them. I then put a sanding wheel on my drill and sanded out a small valley that would act as a divot for each wand to sit in. By looking at the front of the display, I figured out how low my first peg would need to be to clear the arch. Yours might be different, so make your mark based on your measurements by looking at the front of the display. I also did this from the bottom to ensure I was not too far down and into the bottom of the arch for my last set of pegs. I measured out about 7.5 inches from each side. From my first mark, I subsequently marked down the line. I just drew at 2-inch intervals. Now grab your drill and put in the pilot holes on each mark. Grab a scrap piece of wood to hold up against the face while you do this. This will keep your drill bit from snagging on the felt and twisting it. Using 3/4 inch screws, fill all your pilot holes. With all your screws in place, you can now flip your display back right side up. Stain your pegs and allow time to dry. Put on a second coat if needed because dowels are coated sometimes and it's hard for the stain to absorb into the wood. Once they are dry, you can simply screw them into position. Place each peg's pilot hole onto the tip of the screw and thread on until tight. Ensure to stop when the wand's divot is facing upward. With some tape, clean up your felt and add your wands. In the end, this was a very fun project to do. And overall, this display is super light. There should be no problems hanging this on any wall. So, as always, thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next project.